O Roda Verde é um programa de entrevistas coletivas em que jornalistas de veículos brasileiros especializados em cannabis sabatinam personalidades de peso do universo da erva. Chamamos para essa roda pessoas que pensam, mobilizam e realizam essa pauta na sociedade através do ativismo social e cultural, de disputas políticas nas instituições, educando e ou empreendendo neste setor. Eu sou Márcio Macanã e serei o mediador da nossa conversa. Participam comigo dessa roda os jornalistas Thaís Rickman, do portal Smoke Buddies, Mônica Pupo, do portal Marihuana, Fernanda Soldeira, da Revista Ganja, Jaqueline Passos, do portal Sechat, Marcos Bruno, do portal Cannabis Saúde e do Santa Cannabis Podcast, e Wagner Bordim, do portal Lideria. O cara é simplesmente um dos maiores ativistas pela legalização da maconha e o seu desenvolvimento no mundo. É ativista social, escritor, palestrante, investidor e empreendedor do setor. Natural do estado norte-americano da Filadélfia, Steve DeAngelo vem atuando há mais de 40 anos na linha de frente do movimento de reforma da maconha nos Estados Unidos. Suas realizações mais notáveis incluem a cofundação do Harborside, um dos primeiros dispensários de maconha licenciados nos Estados Unidos e considerado um dos maiores do mundo. O laboratórios Chip Hill, a primeira empresa de análise de cannabis. O grupo Arcview, a primeira rede dedicada a investimentos em cannabis. A National Cannabis Industry Association, a primeira associação comercial da indústria. E o projeto The Last Prisoner, dedicado a combater a injustiça criminal e a repensar a política de drogas nos Estados Unidos. Steve DeAngelo publicou em 2015 nos Estados Unidos seu livro O Manifesto da Cannabis, um novo paradigma de bem-estar, obra em que responde a perguntas essenciais e propõe uma discussão ponderada sobre a ciência e as leis sobre a maconha, bem como seus efeitos biológicos, mentais e espirituais sobre os seres humanos. Você já esteve com dúvidas em relação à sua posição sobre a cannabis? Eu também estive, e foi pensando assim que o Roda Verde chamou para conversar nada mais nada menos que Steve DeAngelo, que está lançando o livro O Manifesto da Cannabis aqui no Brasil. E eu já aproveito para começar o nosso papo perguntando como está a sua expectativa para o recebimento do livro pelo público brasileiro, uma vez que ainda temos uma legislação sobre a cannabis bastante limitada por aqui.
Well, my hope is that the release of the Cannabis Manifesto in Brazil can help spark more conversation, can spark more public debate about the issue. What I've learned about cannabis is that when the true facts about cannabis are presented to people in a simple way that they can understand, that the debate is almost over as soon as it begins. All of the facts around cannabis and legalizing cannabis are so compelling that it's just really a matter of presenting them to people in a format that they can understand. So I wrote the book for two purposes. One was to empower people who already believe in cannabis legalization to be able to make the best argument possible so that they could help convince other people. And the second purpose related to that was so anybody who was opposed to cannabis or just hadn't made up their mind yet would be able to have a book that they could read that would change their mind. So that's the purpose. The purpose of the Cannabis Manifesto is to change people's minds about cannabis, and then use that change in mentality as a way to change the laws.
Muito obrigado pela resposta, Steve. E agora, começando a nossa primeira rodada de perguntas, eu chamo a Fernanda. Por favor, Fernanda, fique à vontade.
Oi, Steve. Primeiro de tudo, eu queria agradecer a oportunidade de estar aqui participando dessa conversa. E a minha primeira pergunta é em relação à guerra às drogas. Hoje, alguns países já estão mais à frente em relação à descriminalização, à normalização e à legalização do uso da cannabis, mas o Brasil ainda sofre bastante com o proibicionismo. Como que você vê essa relação da guerra às drogas, que hoje é mais uma guerra às pessoas que consomem cannabis do que qualquer outra coisa?
Yeah, well, what we have seen all around the world is this war on drugs that largely started being driven by the United States and by massive grants and diplomatic pressure from the United States. This began in the early 1960s when the notorious Harry Anslinger, who I write about in my book, he was the man who made cannabis illegal at the federal level in the United States, was appointed to be the commissioner at the United Nations for the United States. And he used that position to coerce countries all around the world, either to make cannabis illegal or to greatly increase their enforcement of cannabis laws. So this was really the beginning of this effort. And then in 1968, President Nixon really put a lot more emphasis behind that, first in Mexico and then all around the world. So since then, we've seen this militarization of the quote unquote the war on drugs. What many people don't understand is that the war on drugs in the United States, at least, has mostly been a war on cannabis. More people have been arrested on cannabis charges and imprisoned on cannabis charges than people who have been arrested for all other drug charges put together. In fact, in the United States, and I'm not sure how it is in Brazil, but in the United States, more people are arrested for cannabis charges than all other violent crimes put together. And what we've seen is that this war has been focused on communities of color. In the United States, African American communities, Mexican American communities, Black people, and brown people are arrested at a rate of 3 to 4 times the rate that white people are. And what we've seen is that the cannabis laws really are being used as a form of social control. If you go to the city of Chicago in the United States, for example, before the state of Illinois made cannabis legal last year, 90% of the people in the city who were arrested on cannabis charges were Black people, while they only accounted for 40% of the population of the city. So it's not so much about the plant, but the people who are using the plant. And this is a pattern that we see all around the world. I'm sure that it's true in Brazil as well.
Mais uma ótima resposta, muito obrigado, Steve. E agora nós trazemos para a roda a Thaís.
Olá, é um prazer estar aqui com vocês. Steve, no seu livro você narra algumas visões para o futuro da cannabis que já são realidade em estados que passaram por processos de regulamentação nos Estados Unidos, como, por exemplo, lojas chiques ou até as regras para desencorajar o uso por menores de idade, por exemplo. Agora, sobre redução do encarceramento, liberação de pessoas acusadas de crimes não violentos relacionados à cannabis e a limpeza desses registros criminais. Como você vê esses processos acontecendo hoje? E eu queria que você contasse um pouquinho sobre o seu projeto relacionado ao tema.
Yes, I'd be happy to speak on those topics. One would imagine that when a society decides to change its cannabis laws and make cannabis legal, that simply as a matter of course, automatically, that all cannabis prisoners would be released. Because how can we continue to punish somebody for something that is no longer a crime? But unfortunately, that's not the way that it's happened in the United States so far. In almost every single piece of legalization legislation that was passed, no provisions were made for the release of cannabis prisoners. And the result is that even though cannabis is legal in many, many U.S. states, a majority of U.S. states, either for medical or adult use purposes, there are still 40,000 people in prison in the United States on cannabis charges. Some of them are there for extremely long sentences. We have a gentleman named Russell Allen in the state of Mississippi, who the chief court of the state of Mississippi just affirmed a sentence of him for life without parole sentence for 30 grams of cannabis. So we continue to see just horrific prison sentences being given to people for very, very small cannabis crimes at a time when a legal industry in the United States has been created that many people are getting wealthy off of, making a huge amount of money. Now, most of the people who are making money off of legal cannabis look like me. They're old white guys. Most of the people who are in prison on cannabis charges are black people and brown people because of the disproportionate enforcement of the laws. This led me in 2019 to create an organization called the Last Prisoner Project. It has a very simple mission, and that's to make sure that as we build this legal industry in the United States and all around the world, that we make sure that all of the people who are in prison on cannabis charges are released and are given the resources that they need to rebuild the lives that were stolen from them. And we have begun this work here. We're doing two things mainly in the United States. One is trying to make sure that moving forward, anytime we pass legislation legalizing cannabis, that it includes prisoner release. And number two, just working on making sure that people who are in prison now are released. We've had a pretty good year this year. Several hundred people were released, including some of the longest serving cannabis prisoners in the United States. But the work has just begun. And we are committed to doing this work until the last cannabis prisoner on planet Earth is released. This is something that we intend to be a global struggle, and we call on all people who love this plant, wherever you are on the planet, to adopt this as a sacred mission. Our work cannot be done until all of our sisters and brothers come home.
Steve, muito obrigado pela resposta. E para dar continuidade às nossas questões, o Wagner, da Wideria.
Olá, Steve, tudo bom? Meu nome é Wagner Bordin, sou editor do Wideria e é um grande prazer poder estar aqui conversando contigo sobre a maconha. No seu livro, O Manifesto da Cannabis, você explica o conceito do empreendedorismo social. Eu queria que você nos contasse um pouco sobre ele e como ele se aplica à indústria da maconha.
So social entrepreneurship is the idea that we can create businesses that both allow us to support our families, to earn a livelihood, and to create positive change in the world. So I'll give you one example of that. We know now today that for every hectare of hemp that is harvested, of industrial hemp, that 20 tons of atmospheric carbon can be sequestered. We also know that that concrete can be made, hempcrete can be made out of those hemp plants, and that buildings can actually be made out of that hempcrete that will sequester additional atmospheric carbon. So, fortunately, there's a great deal of demand in the world today for those hemp buildings. So one brilliant piece of social entrepreneurship is growing hemp and building buildings out of it. There's a company in Colombia called Core Pro Pause that is working on a project to bring former combatants in the civil conflict in Colombia together to grow 10,000 hectares of hemp and then use that hemp to build a village where all of them will live. Once they've completed that project, they will be amongst the world's foremost experts in hemp construction techniques, which are going to be one of the most important growth sectors in construction industry moving forward. This is just one example of the ways that people can participate in the legal cannabis industry, make a good living, perhaps build some wealth, and also help improve the planet, engage in positive change.
Seguindo a nossa rodada de perguntas, temos o Marcos. Por favor, Marcos.
Olá, Steve, muito obrigado por estar aqui com a gente hoje. É uma honra para todo mundo poder conversar com uma figura tão importante para esse setor, né? Mas antes de mais nada, quando é que você vem para o Brasil para autografar o meu livro?
I'm actually hoping to come to Brazil in October. The date hasn't been confirmed yet, but I'm hoping that I'll be able to visit you in October before the end of the month.
Bom, vamos lá. Steve, no seu livro, o Manifesto da Cannabis, né, você afirma que a cannabis não destrói as famílias, mas a guerra às drogas, esta sim destrói as famílias. Você inclusive citou o seu caso pessoal, que acabou se afastando dos seus pais, saindo de casa por causa do seu uso de maconha na adolescência. Eu me identifico muito com a sua história, me identifiquei ao ler o livro, porque eu também fui um adolescente usuário e hoje eu sou um pai usuário também. Aqui no Brasil, a força política aí que nos governa tem um forte discurso moralista, de pauta de costumes, pela família, por Deus e contra as drogas. Então, queria que você contasse um pouco, agora para o grande público brasileiro, um pouquinho melhor sobre esse teu argumento. A cannabis não destrói as famílias, mas sim a guerra às drogas.
I'd be happy to, and I think the best way that I can explain that is through my own personal experience. I was very close to my parents. They always taught me to always be honest, to never lie to them, never lie to anybody, never do anything that I wasn't proud of letting the world know about. And that was the way that I lived my life, and I've tried to live my life since then. But there was just one period of time when I started getting into cannabis. And I knew, because my parents had talked to me about it, that they would disapprove of me using cannabis or being involved with it in any way. I also knew that it was illegal. I was going to school. They were, had this propaganda that they were talking about at school. And so for really the first time in my life about anything, I hid my consumption of cannabis from my parents. And I felt bad about it. I felt guilty, not about using cannabis, but I felt guilty because I was hiding it from my parents. There came a time when my mother was putting away some clothes. I had not hidden my cannabis very well. She found the cannabis. She discovered it. And I got into a huge amount of trouble with my parents. I was so, I think, ashamed, really, of having lied to them, that I left home for the first time. I moved away at 13 years old. I wasn't able to stay away for very long, but it was a horrible experience that set a whole tone of mistrust in my relationship with my parents that had never happened before. So at the time, so moving forward into the future, many years pass. We go into the future, and my parents get older. They start having some physical conditions. I start working on medical cannabis. And as time went on, I was able to introduce both of my parents to using medical cannabis, and they used it very, very effectively. And it was really this healing in our relationship. It was a coming together, and a lot of the wounds that had opened up during that earlier time were healed. But this is something that's happened in many, many American families, where we've had young people who have used cannabis. They've used it successfully. My cannabis use has never been problematic for me in my life. It's never caused any issues in my family, except because I lied to my parents about using it. But yet, it because of the laws, because of the propaganda, it created this huge distance in my relationship with my parents, and I know that it's operated in that way in many, many American families. And enough time has gone on now that it's not just the children who are lying to their parents about cannabis use. It's parents who are using cannabis who hide it from their children and lie to their children about it because they're afraid that they don't want their children to get in trouble. It's employees who lie to their employers about it. It's lawyers who lie to their clients about it. It's clients who lie to their lawyers about it. It's teachers who lie to their students about it. It's students who lie to their teachers about it. It's everybody lying to each other because cannabis use is so widespread. And so there's just this huge amount of mistrust that's been put into society. So one of the great things that's happened now that we've had some legalization in the United States is that all these people who were hiding their cannabis use from each other are becoming open about it. And they're going, you've been smoking all this time too? You, my lawyer, my teacher, my son, my mother. Really, Mom? You've been doing it all this time? And so it's bringing this time of healing. It's a wonderful thing to see.
Valeu, Steve. Muito obrigado por mais essa resposta. E agora, com a palavra, a Mônica.
Olá, pessoal, tudo bem? Bom, em primeiro lugar, eu gostaria de agradecer às equipes do Cannabis Monitor e da editora Vista Chinesa pelo convite e a oportunidade de participar desse bate-papo. Steve, muito obrigado, é uma honra estar aqui trocando essa ideia contigo. E eu gostaria de saber, no seu livro, O Manifesto da Cannabis, que foi lançado em 2015, você fala de um conceito muito interessante que é o paradigma do bem-estar. E eu queria saber, 6 anos depois, e no contexto de uma pandemia global que a gente está vivendo hoje, como você avalia a importância da maconha para o bem-estar das populações em geral?
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about the concept of wellness. I think when I look at the Cannabis Manifesto, I think that one of the most original ideas that I was able to articulate in the book is the idea that cannabis really should be understood as a wellness product. In the United States, we have medical cannabis and quote unquote recreational cannabis. But I don't believe there's really such a thing as recreational cannabis. I think that when you really understand the reasons that people use cannabis and the effects that cannabis has, that they're properly understood as wellness. Wellness obviously includes using cannabis for things like chronic pain or to shrink cancer tumors or to quell epileptic seizures. Obviously, those are wellness purposes. But there's a whole range of other wellness uses of cannabis that aren't as well understood. There's of course things like depression and insomnia and anxiety that cannabis is very, very effective for. But then there's things like sparking creativity, extending patience, waking up a sense of play, enhancing sexuality, enhancing openness to spiritual experience, teaching better ways of resolving confrontations, the way that cannabis can turn an argument into a conversation, or help a poet find just the right word, or a painter find just the right color, or can turn a walk through a park into a spiritual experience. These things are not properly understood as getting high, as escaping. It's not like snorting cocaine or drinking alcohol or shooting heroin. It's a different experience entirely. These are some of the most valuable experiences in our lives, being close to the people that we love. I have mothers and fathers who have talked to me about how they have a wonderful time playing with their children when they've had 1 or 2 hits of cannabis, the way that can just open them up to that sense of play. I've talked to couples who have been on the verge of divorce, who haven't made love in years, until cannabis comes into their life and they rekindle what brought them together in the first place. I've talked to artists who have been completely blocked, who unable to produce anything until they were able to ingest a little bit of cannabis and free up that flow. All of these things are properly understood as wellness uses of cannabis.
E para encerrar essa nossa primeira rodada de perguntas, a questão da Jaqueline.
Olá, Steve. É um prazer enorme estar falando com você. Sobre o livro, você diz que boa parte da população norte-americana já está consciente dos benefícios tanto da cannabis quanto da legalização nos Estados Unidos. Quais foram os fatores que ajudaram o povo americano a abraçar essa causa e o que ainda é necessário fazer para que haja a legalização em nível federal?
So I think that what was really what changed the tide of the legalization movement, the cannabis freedom movement in the United States, was when we started presenting cannabis as something other than just something that you got high on. In the first part of our movement, we didn't know the history of cannabis. We didn't know about the medical benefits of cannabis. All that we knew was that when we smoked cannabis, we thought that it made us better people, more kind, more gentle, and that we hoped it would do the same thing for other people. And so when we first started trying to make it legal, we talked about personal freedom. We talked about our rights as American citizens. We talked about liberty. And to be honest with you, we didn't get very far. We had a little bit of success, but not much. It was only after we started talking about the whole plant, about all the ways that we use this plant, the way that it can be used, the medical properties of cannabis, the industrial properties of cannabis. And it took several years of talking about that and putting that information out to the public. I think we really started talking about medical cannabis in a serious way in the mid to late 1980s. It took until 1996 that we passed our first medical cannabis law in California. But something very important happened with that law and subsequent medical cannabis laws. People who had never, ever used cannabis before, had never even thought about using cannabis, who would never allow a joint to touch their lips, started using cannabis because their doctors recommended it to them for serious medical conditions. And most of those people had a dramatically positive experience with cannabis. In many cases, it saved their lives. And so naturally, these people who formerly were not into cannabis, who maybe were opposed to cannabis, told their friends and their relatives about the positive experience they'd had. And so many of those people, when they had medical issues, they also tried cannabis. And they had the same positive experience. And so there was this effect of a chain reaction as more and more people used cannabis for medical purposes and had a positive reaction to it. They engaged with their friends and relatives and changed their minds. And this was really important because cannabis is so controversial. The debate is so hot around it that most people are not very open to information from the other side. Most people have already made up their mind, and they'll just say, oh, it's the prohibitionists, or oh, it's the legalizers, and not listen to the information. But when your father or your mother or your auntie or your uncle or your cousin comes to you and says, I know that you have an illness, this plant saved me, I think it can save you, it's a different reaction. And so that's really what changed public opinion in the United States. And over a course of about 15 years, we went from just under 50% of people who approved of legalizing cannabis. Today, when you include medical and adult use cannabis in the United States, 90% of Americans support the legalization of cannabis. So it's that direct experience. Legalization at the federal level in the United States is a different matter. It's really a function of anti-democratic forces in the American political system. So 90% of American people support legalization. A majority of individual states have legalized cannabis in some way. The blockade at the federal level is in the U.S. Senate. And in the U.S. Senate, it takes 60, there are 100 senators, but it takes 60 votes to pass a piece of legislation. 60 votes, not a simple majority. And this is the reason that cannabis remains illegal at the federal level in the United States of America today. Our lower house, the Congress of the United States, has already passed comprehensive legalization of cannabis. It's the Senate that is a blockade, and it's the same white, racist, Republican senators who are blocking cannabis legislation that are blocking voting rights legislation and most of the other progressive legislation that's stalled in the United States today. That's the reason.
Bom, que conversa maravilhosa. Muito obrigado aos jornalistas aqui presentes, trazendo essas questões. Muito obrigado você, Steve, também por trazer essas reflexões maravilhosas para a gente aqui no Brasil. Vamos dar início agora à nossa segunda rodada de perguntas. E quem começa essa segunda rodada é o Marcos.
Bom, Steve, o Brasil é um dos países mais racistas do mundo. Nós somos disparado o país que mais recebeu escravizados da África e fomos o último país a abolir a escravidão. A guerra às drogas, a gente sabe, é uma continuação de uma política pública racista. E, possivelmente, seremos o último país aqui da América Latina a legalizar a maconha. Quase todos os nossos vizinhos já legalizaram alguma forma de cultivo, Uruguai, Argentina, Paraguai, Equador, Colômbia, quase todos. Falta só o Brasil e Venezuela e a Bolívia mesmo. Bom, se esse atraso tem um lado bom, que seja, esse lado bom é que a gente pode aprender com os erros dos países que já legalizaram. Então eu te pergunto, o que o Brasil pode aprender para não repetir os erros de países já legalizes aí como Canadá, Estados Unidos, a Holanda e aqui o Uruguai?
So thank you for that question. It's a great question. So let's first think about what makes the cannabis industry unique and special. Right? Most industries grow in back rooms, in boardrooms, in meetings between investors. There's not a public process. People don't get to weigh in on it. By the time a new industry enters the market, its standards, its morality, its structure, who's going to make money and how that money is made, all of those things are already determined in most cases. But with cannabis, legal cannabis, it's different. Our industry begins with a law, and that law happens around a public debate, and it gives everybody an opportunity to weigh in, to think about in a conscious way how we want to create this new industry. And what I believe is that we should not just create a new industry, but take this opportunity, this unique opportunity, to create a new kind of industry. That, unfortunately, has not been done for the most part in the United States and in Canada thus far. What you see is the same people who control and profit from almost every other business in the United States, moving into cannabis and taking control of it. So as cannabis has become more legal, we've seen more and more established business companies and investors entering into the space. People who had no connection to the cannabis movement, who didn't participate in making it legal, who just basically sat on the sidelines, who don't come out of the cannabis community. And unfortunately, what's happened is a lot of the early pioneers in the industry, a lot of people who in the traditional unregulated cannabis market, people of color who were making money that way, are now being squeezed out of the industry. And it's becoming dominated by large public corporations that are listed on public stock exchanges in Canada and in the United States, who have raised billions and billions of dollars in capital. In California, what happened is that that capital came into the state and was put into the hands of people who essentially used it to squeeze out all of the pioneers, all of the activists who had built the earliest cannabis businesses. And it's really a tragedy. So What should Brazil learn? Brazil should learn this, that unless the law is constructed in such a way to ensure that a new kind of industry is created, to ensure that people who usually do not get opportunities to create wealth or to create prosperity are given those opportunities, then the same thing will happen. And those laws need to be strong. They need to be tough. We're beginning to do it here in the United States. The state of New York is a great example where 50% of the cannabis licenses have been reserved to go to people who come from communities that have been disproportionately impacted by the war on cannabis, meaning Black and brown people who usually are excluded from business opportunities in this country as they are in Brazil. So that's what needs to happen, but it will be a tough battle. It is everywhere.
Bom, nós temos um projeto de lei tramitando no Congresso Nacional, o PL 399/15, que legaliza o cultivo de cannabis, mas apenas por empresas e pelo governo. O cultivo por pacientes, ele não foi autorizado. Os autores do projeto acreditam que se fosse previsto o cultivo por pacientes, ele não passaria nem na primeira comissão.
Right. Well, this is pathetic, right? It's pathetic and it's disgusting, and it should not be accepted. And we've seen the same pattern around the world, where there are governments who want to build a legal cannabis industry and prosper off of it, but don't want to allow their own citizens to use cannabis. And just imagine if every country in the world adopted that position. That yes, we'll grow cannabis and we'll produce products from it, but our people can't use it. There would be no legal cannabis industry anywhere. So it's a ridiculous position, but it's even beyond that. It's really criminal, because this is what we know about cannabis, that it is quite likely the most effective medicine on planet Earth. We now have plenty of evidence showing the efficacy of cannabis for a very, very wide range of medical conditions at a price that's far lower than pharmaceuticals are. So any government that is denying their people access to cannabis medicine literally is killing its own people. In Brazil, for example, there are hundreds of thousands, or at least tens of thousands, of people who are suffering very, very severe epilepsy. It's something that many people die from every year, and even if they don't die from it, their lives are incredibly disrupted. Cannabis will cure every single one of those cases immediately, very, very simply and very inexpensively. So who are the real criminals? The real criminals aren't people who carry this plant through the darkness of prohibition. The real criminals aren't people who use this medicine that Mother Nature gave to all of us. The real criminals are the people who write these laws and enforce these laws that create such death and destruction.
Muito obrigado pela resposta, Steve. E agora, para a segunda pergunta, a Mônica.
Steve, quais argumentos você acha que são mais importantes e mais irrefutáveis na luta pela legalização da maconha?
Well, the fact of the matter is that it's very difficult to convince people who have already decided that cannabis is a bad thing that it is a good thing. Right? That's very, very difficult to do. It's a big lift. But what is not so difficult is to convince people that prohibition of cannabis is even a worse thing than cannabis itself. So this is the argument that really also was helpful in the United States. We talked about medical cannabis, we talked about industrial hemp, and the ways that those arguments were useful in changing people's mind. This is really the third main argument that we use to change people's mind, which is the idea that cannabis is not harmful, but prohibition is. So when you prohibit cannabis, what happens? Well, first of all, you have the police spending a whole lot of time and a whole lot of money chasing a plant that never hurt anybody. which means that they're not doing things like, finding people who are raping and murdering people, or finding companies that are putting industrial pollution into our waterways. There's only so many law enforcement resources. So real criminals are getting away with crimes because police are chasing the plant. That all costs a huge amount of money. So there are a huge amount of tax dollars that are then going to be devoted to doing that. All of that enforcement creates a criminal underground. And so you have organized crime organizations, which are then move into cannabis and along with other criminal activities. And they use the money that they make from cannabis to buy weapons, to corrupt politicians, and to engage in other activities that are really, really harmful. Then those routes of distribution go all across the country into schools all across the country. And the same routes of distribution that are used for cannabis are then used for other more dangerous drugs like cocaine and heroin and methadone. So what you see is a decrease in law enforcement efficiency, a rise in crime, wasting of tax dollars, the creation of a criminal underground, and the facilitating of putting hard drugs into the hands of children all across the country. So there's these very demonstrable, obvious harms that come from keeping cannabis illegal. And so what we've gone to people and said is, look, even if you don't like cannabis, right, understand that it's better for cannabis to be sold at a licensed cannabis dispensary, because at a licensed cannabis dispensary, a child is not going to be served. At a licensed cannabis dispensary, hard drugs are not going to be sold along with the cannabis. At a licensed cannabis dispensary, disputes are not going to be solved with acts of violence that could spill over and hurt civilians. So you allow the police to focus on real crimes. You take power and money away from criminals. You create legal jobs and investment opportunities, and you reduce social pathologies and addictions. So even for people who don't like cannabis, legal cannabis is better than illegal cannabis.
Muito bom. E quem traz a próxima pergunta é a Jaqueline.
Atualmente, o tema cannabis já é falado em todo o mundo. Porém, nem sempre foi assim, né? Como foi para você, Steve, fazer parte de uma geração que nem sonhava com a regulamentação em nível federal? E como é para você hoje ver tantas empresas ligadas, né, à planta se desenvolvendo tão rapidamente?
Well, it's just wonderful. It feels so much better than if we had lost this struggle. When I began doing this 50 years ago now, I started my activist career when I was 13 years old. I'm 63 years old now. Everybody that we talked to about legalizing cannabis said that it was just a crazy hippie dream, that it would never, ever, ever happen. And today, cannabis is legal in many places, and it's going to be legal in many more places tomorrow. And one day, maybe within your lifetimes, cannabis is going to be legal everywhere around the world. Not only is it going to be legal everywhere around the world, it is, by dollar volume, going to be the most valuable crop, the most valuable product on the planet, because anything that we make from petroleum or trees or cotton can instead be made from cannabis. And that's clearly the direction that we need to move in, and that is where we're going. So that feels great to me. I call your generation the smartest generation. You all grew up with these keyboards in your hands, and you have this unparalleled ability to find new information, to find the facts, to find the truth, to synthesize it into new ideas, to take action and to make change. And so for me to see your generation getting behind the cannabis freedom movement and accelerating it and pushing it all around the world, it's the most wonderful thing that could happen to me in my life. I hate to think about how I would feel today if the other side was winning.
Para nossa quarta pergunta, com a palavra, Fernanda.
Steve, hoje a cannabis está no seu auge e cada vez mais pessoas, principalmente em plataformas digitais, vêm e falam sobre isso, falam sobre o seu uso pessoal também. Como que você vê essa importância de pessoas de diferentes áreas falando abertamente sobre isso e a questão da representatividade nesse meio?
So I think that this is, one of the most important things in moving our movement forward. If we take a look at the history of the gay liberation movement in the United States, the time at which it really started gaining traction, that it started really building force, gaining in popularity, changing laws, was when gay people decided that they were going to come out of the closet. When they found the courage to say, yes, I am gay, I'm going to admit it, I'm going to tell my friends, I'm going to tell my employers. And the same process needs to happen with cannabis. If society at large really understood everyone who's using cannabis now, it would probably be legalized in a matter of days, because what we know in the cannabis community is that even people who are part of the system of oppression against us are also using cannabis. We know that there's prosecutors. We know that there are judges who prosecute cannabis cases. We know there's judges who sentence people for cannabis crimes. We know that there are police who seize cannabis who are all using cannabis themselves. We know that some of the most talented scientists in the world use cannabis. Some of the most popular entertainers in the world use cannabis. Some of the most important thinkers and intellectuals in the world use cannabis. Some of the most important religious leaders and elected officials use cannabis. But there's this huge fear. There's this huge stigma. People are afraid to come out. One by one, people's careers can be destroyed. One by one, people can be taken to prison. But if everybody who consumed cannabis came out of their cannabis closet tomorrow, the world would be an entirely different place. And so I think it's a really important step in our movement. I think that it's a challenging step for a lot of people to take. I think we have to build some support for people to be able to take that step. But it's something that I encourage anybody who's in a position where they can afford to do that, where they can take that risk. It is so powerful. And here in the United States, I think that we've taken the risk about admitting cannabis use down low enough that what I call on people to do is something very simple. Just pick one person every week that doesn't know about your cannabis use and explain to them that you use cannabis. You don't have to tell everybody all at once. You don't have to make a huge campaign out of it, but just take care of them one at a time, one a week, until everybody that you know, everybody in your life knows the truth of your cannabis use. So I think it'd be a great thing to see spread around the world.
Valeu pela resposta, Steve. Agora eu passo a palavra para o Wagner.
Steve, você escreveu o livro Manifesto da Cannabis em 2015 e desde então muita coisa mudou. Eu queria que você nos contasse como você vê o cenário da maconha nos próximos 10 anos.
Oh, well, I think that in the next 10 years, we're certainly going to see federal legalization in the United States. Federal legalization in the United States is going to be a signal to the rest of the world, a powerful signal to the rest of the world. It was pressure from the United States that convinced most countries around the world to either impose or to make cannabis prohibition much more strict. And so we'll see a chain reaction all around the world as that happens. I think we're also going to see a explosive growth of industrial hemp. If you take a look at what we need to do in the world today, more than anything, obviously, is find new ways of producing the goods that we need to survive, to take care of ourselves. Right now, human beings are producing the goods that we need to survive in a way that's destroying our planet. And we have very, very little time left. But Mother Nature was so wise and so generous to us when she gave us the cannabis plant, because at one time, this plant will wake up our minds and our consciousness and open our hearts and bring us closer to nature and understand that this work needs to be done. And at the same time, gives us the raw material that we need to make our clothing, to power our cars, to produce electricity for our homes, to build our homes, to give us a way of nourishing ourselves with protein without killing animals, to have paper and packaging without cutting down the last tree on the planet. So we're going to see explosive growth in the hemp sector. And I think that we're going to see certainly medical cannabis become a reality in almost every country on the planet. The science is now in. It's very clear that the rediscovery of the therapeutic properties of cannabis is the most important medical breakthrough, at least since the discovery of germ theory, if not the most important medical breakthrough of all time. And so as more and more research is done, you're going to see the current catalog of medicines that's being used in the world shift dramatically towards cannabis-derived medicines, both in the pharmaceutical and in the natural whole plant medicine sector. So I'd say that in 10 years, we probably see about 50% of the medicines on planet Earth shift to being cannabis-based medicines. The only thing that would hold us back from seeing all of these things is a failure of governments to accept the science, to accept the reality of what's going on with cannabis. So the potential is just tremendous. We know now that we can stop global warming simply by planting hemp, simply by converting our economies from petroleum, from timber, from cotton to hemp. That's the future. And that's hopefully we're well on our way to achieving that future in 10 years.
Galera, essa conversa tá maravilhosa, mas o nosso tempo com o Steve é um pouco curto. Então chegamos agora à sexta pergunta da nossa segunda bateria de perguntas. Com vocês, a Thaís.
Bom, para fechar, eu queria saber, na sua opinião, qual a importância de ativistas participarem da indústria legal de cannabis e se você já sentiu alguma vez o seu lado empreendedor conflitando com o seu lado ativista e como você reflete sobre isso.
Let me answer the second part of the question first by saying yes, absolutely, all the time. If you want to be a social entrepreneur, if you want to be an activist who has a business, you need to be prepared for the fact that there are going to be a lot of difficult decisions that you are going to have to make. And there's no formula for those decisions. I'll give you an example. Suppose you have a cannabis dispensary and you're committed to using only eco-friendly packaging. But that eco-friendly packaging costs you 3 times as much as regular packaging does. Everything's fine. Your sales are good. Your customers are supporting you until a dispensary opens across the street who's using regular packaging. And they're selling their cannabis goods for 10% less than you are. And they start pulling your customers away. And your sales start going down. And they keep on going down. And soon you have difficulty meeting your payroll or making your rent. And you have a choice. Do you keep on using the eco-friendly packaging? Or do you consider an alternative that's going to allow you to reduce your prices and compete? What do you do? Very, very difficult decisions. And there's no formula. You just have to answer them as best as you can, to look into your heart and to always try to do the right thing. For me, I've always chosen to err on the side of my principles and my values wherever I can. Sometimes that's meant leaving a lot of money on the table, and not everybody's in a position to be able to afford to do that. How important is it for people who love cannabis to be in the cannabis industry? I think it's really critically important. Human beings are wonderful but perverse creatures. We can be angels and we can be demons. And to put it simply, and excuse my language, we can fuck up almost anything. And we can do it with cannabis too. Right now there are a lot of companies who are working on creating traditional pharmaceutical medications from cannabis, where they will isolate monomolecules and create the same type of monomolecule pharmaceuticals that we've seen them do with everything else. And I don't think that there's any reason to assume that we wouldn't see the same results from that kind of approach that we've seen with all of the other pharmaceuticals. Mother Nature gave us cannabis in a whole plant format for a reason, right? And yet, us human beings are trying to break her into these monomolecules. Why? Well, there's no reason. We already know that monomolecule cannabis preparations are less effective than whole plant preparations by far. The only reason to do it is so that we can make money. And that's just one example of the ways that we could get cannabis legalization wrong. So if people who love the plant don't get into the mix, don't put themselves in the position of being able to make those difficult decisions, then we're simply going to leave the playing field to people who care nothing other than money, other than greed. And so I really almost beg people who love this plant, please get involved in the industry. It won't be easy. It'll be difficult. You'll have those hard choices to make, but this is maybe our last best chance to save the planet. Look at what's happening in the world today, the kind of distress that's happening, the religious intolerance, the amount of violence that's going on, the horrific nature of the violence, the way that intolerance is building everywhere, the way that in spite of all of the evidence of what's happening with global warming, we keep on pumping more oil, we keep on creating technologies that burn more and more energy. How do we get out of this mess, right? I mean, young people are so disturbed, and they should be disturbed, that they're blowing themselves up all over the world, right? What takes us off of this track other than cannabis, other than this plant that wakes up our souls, that brings us in touch with nature, that gives us the tools that we need to stop global warming and to eventually clean up the toxic mess that we've made. That only happens if people who love this plant get involved in the industry. So please do.
Que encontro incrível, pessoal! Eu espero que vocês tenham aprendido tanto quanto eu aprendi nessa conversa. Lembrando que essa é só a primeira edição do nosso programa Roda Verde. Queria agradecer aqui de coração quem está assistindo a gente, agradecer também aos jornalistas envolvidos nessa proposta e ao Steve, que trouxe a luz da sua experiência e a sua luta aqui pra gente. Sendo assim, Steve, eu deixo para você a palavra final nessa conversa. Por favor.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really been a pleasure. I've enjoyed all of the questions. I look forward to doing it again. All of you should know how to get in touch with me. Feel free to reach out, Steve at stevedeangelo.com. We can continue the dialogue. What I have to say to the people who love cannabis in Brazil is this. I had an incredible opportunity in 2019 to travel to 4 different continents around the world and meet with the cannabis tribe, to meet with people who love cannabis. And what I found was that no matter where we are, no matter what our religion, no matter our economic background, no matter what language we speak, no matter what our orientation is, our educational level, or how we make our living, that we live by the same value system. That no matter where we are, we value creativity, and we don't think so much of conformity. Individual freedom is really, really important, and people who have coercive authority are deeply suspicious to us. We love nature, and we're deeply opposed to people who are destroying it. We embrace generosity, and we stay away from greed. We try to welcome diversity and inclusion into our lives. This is who we are, no matter where we are around the world. And today, there's hundreds of millions of us all around the world. The United Nations says there's 270 million regular cannabis smokers in the world. I think it's more like 1 billion. Collectively, we are as large or larger than all but the largest nations on this earth. And we have an incredible power once we learn how to recognize each other, to talk to each other, to reason with each other, to learn how to move as one. Then we will claim this destiny, and the cannabis tribe is going to step up and put the planet back into balance. That's the destiny that's in front of us, and so I'm so happy that the book is now coming out to Brazil. Can't wait to come there and meet the Brazilian branch of the Cannabis Tribe.